Welcome to the Inside the Box podcast. I'm your host, Hans Zappin, and I am joined in studio today by Preston Thompson. Preston, thank you for joining me here today, and I want to introduce you to the listeners here too. So you were the campaign manager for Mary Robichaux in the Roswell HD 48 race.
Yes, I was.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about that. Have you slept since the end of that result?
Slept well. Yeah. I think once I kind of had a good bearing on if we were going to do a recount or not, I took an immediate trip to the beach down in South Carolina and got loads of sleep. But yeah, those last couple weeks, I don't think I've ever done anything like that in my life. It's quite a grind.
I don't know how you guys do it. I'm buddies with Eamon Keegan and had him on the show a couple months ago. And the lack of sleep that guy gets is amazing. Yeah. And he's wired all the time, of course, but I don't know how you guys do it.
Well, I'll say I'm not in a huge hurry to do it again. I'll say that. I did enjoy it very much. Happy that we came out victorious, just barely. But election night, I think I went to bed at 4:30 in the morning and then woke up at 6:30 to call a lawyer. So, and then was up most of those next couple of days trying to make sure numbers came in. And of course, I'm just, refreshing the same web page over and over again. And there's not much I can do, but still I can't sleep because it's just so undecided. So it's tough, but I enjoyed it a lot.
So I want to back up and go and talk a little bit about your background and just how you got into the political sphere. You're a young guy. You mind me ask how old you are?
25.
You're 25.
Jeez.
How long have you been involved in the political sphere?
Not a very long time. My background's public relations communications. I went to school at the University of Alabama, so I know that's not great to be here. Yeah, don't.
I
stop
thought we were going to be friends.
We won't have to get into that. That's for another time. But I went to school for communications and then worked in a couple PR firms and then started volunteering with campaigns. Wasn't feeling like I was...
Statewide,
local.
Okay.
Wasn't feel like I was being as useful as I could have because I was in public relations and communications, but I was doing door knocking and I thought, I can contribute a little better. Mm-hmm. And I really picked up with the Kevin Abel campaign for District 6 Congressional, which he fell short in the primary against Lucy McBath, which on the record, love Lucy, so happy. She's going to be a representative for here, so I think she's fantastic. But after that, I went into Mary's campaign and kind of went from 60 to 100 quickly.
Did you find Mary or did Mary find you?
Mary found me. We had some staff that were, after the Able campaign was over, not everybody got picked up by different teams and things like that. And I was working odd jobs, freelance PR, freelance communications, some writing, some scattered journalism, and she needed somebody and needed someone with a youthful energy, and what that means is someone who wouldn't sleep. So
came to the right place.
Yeah, I think she found that in me. Is even areas where I fall short, I'm still going to work on it for 4 straight days. So it was a good match very quickly.
So tell me about your first impressions of Mary.
So Mary was not really born for politics. She's too nice and she's too caring. She connects with people really, really well. She doesn't have that kind of natural shell that you'd think like a presidential candidate would, which made her perfect and ideal for me. Mm-hmm. I don't know how to teach someone to be caring and empathetic and to connect well with people. I can help somebody along on the things that maybe they're not as familiar with, like canvas mapping, financial, and communications.
The nitty-gritty?
Yeah, the nitty-gritty, the nastiness of it. But she found ways talking to strangers, even when we first met, connecting with people who worked at the restaurant we met in and connecting with them and figuring out what their interests were. And then the last thing she would say is, also, I'm running for public office. And having a candidate think almost backwards in that way was really enticing for me. So I think it was a match really quickly. And I also knew that Mary was in a very vulnerable area of the state in terms of the incumbent. So I knew we had a really good chance to actually make a difference, not just have a good showing.
So how did you know that? Because I think the outcome surprised a lot of people.
Sure. Well, for those who don't know, Mary ran against Dr. Betty Price, who is the wife of Tom Price, who's been my representative, or was my representative, for a very long time. I went to school in Alabama, but I'm from Sandy Springs. She had not run a competitive campaign. This is Dr. Price. She had not run a competitive campaign before the primary she had this same year, against the former mayor of Roswell, Jerry Woods. That was a little closer than I think people thought it was going to be. Both candidates had to spend a lot of money.
A lot of money.
Yeah. And then the general nature that's kind of happening around the country right now, where the suburbs are getting bigger and they're getting more Democratic. So Mary's a fantastic candidate, but looking at the results of this year, you can look at it and see, if not Mary, it's going to be somebody else in 2 years. And if not that person, it's going to be somebody else 2 years after that, because the general shaping of the politics is totally changing. So these areas like Roswell, Alpharetta, and Johns Creek, what used to be just the Democratic stronghold of Atlanta is starting to spread and grow its roots out into the suburban areas.
So you saw a suburban blue wave.
Well, I will say for the first couple weeks we're going around, we're looking at maps, we're looking at numbers. It still felt like it would be an upset. It still felt like we were the underdog. It felt like we had to make up a couple thousand votes here and there. But the more we went around to sections of that community, and Mary would knock on a door and somebody would answer, she'd tell them who she was, and they'd say, "I've never heard from a local representative before. This is the first time that's ever happened." Mm-hmm. And as that started to happen more and more, I went back and I looked at the map and I looked at the number of people we had to get, and I thought, there is no reason we can't talk to every single person that lives here. Mm-hmm. It is very possible we can do that, whether that's in person or at an event or through mail or online, whatever it's going to be. Every single person can hear from us. And if there were enough people that had never heard from that other option before, it would be enough. So it started to feel more likely the further we got, because we're just like the top of the ticket with the Abrams campaign. We're bringing out new voters. And these are voters who haven't really had a strong choice in a while. I mean, House District 48, as it stands in the current map, has never had a Democratic representative. So
ever.
Yeah, ever. Now it was redistricted in 2005, so you're talking, 13 years or so. Sure. But you're having to convince these people this way that it's been your whole life has a chance to change. It's relatively realistic. You have to do something about it, but we can make that happen. And Mary was charismatic enough to get enough of those people out.
Well, I don't think you can win House District 48 without turning at least some Republican voters around and voting for a Democrat.
Sure.
And you guys talked to members of both parties.
Sure.
Mary talked about that here on this podcast, which I guess I'll give a plug real quick. We did have Mary on before the election, so to hear from her, go back in the episode a few episodes, and you can hear that interview. One of the stories that she said on the podcast that I loved is that she'd meet people who'd say, "Oh, well, you're a Democrat, and I'm a Republican." She'd say, "Oh, great. Nice to meet you. I'm Mary."
Right. She didn't like that. And like I said earlier, with the last words out of her mouth would be, "I'm running to be your representative." Right before that was, "I'm the Democrat." Mm-hmm. And any good manager of volunteers, and even I told our volunteers this, when you go out from door to door and you knock on a door, you quickly identify yourself as a Democrat. Because if somebody is, in our current environment, hostile, when you identify yourself by party, you get a nice read on their kind of physical reaction to that, and you can know whether or not to say thank you for your time, goodbye. Mm-hmm. She was the opposite of that, for better or worse. So she would get into conversations with people about these impossible issues. I mean, gun control, everything. And then at the end say, "I'm the Democrat running." And they'd go, "Okay, well, you're not crazy." Mm-hmm. She says, "Well, you're not crazy either. So maybe you'll consider voting for me or going online and learning about more of my things." So it wasn't all transitioning from the other side that won us it. But I mean, in her neighborhood, it was usually about 60-40 of Republican Democratic switch. But she had such a great relationship with those people in her neighborhood. We ended up basically tying that precinct, and that probably was the difference maker. So a lot of it was personal relationships with these people where she's almost coming out to them as a Democrat, and they're going, "Okay, well, I was going to vote for you because you're my friend, but now you're a Democrat. I don't know." And they're juggling these things in their mind, but it ended up working out. Yeah.
And it was close.
162 votes. Yeah.
Went to out of a total of
23,000 or so.
23,000 votes.
Yeah. So we went to a recount, and I sat in a warehouse and watched people run the machines again.
What's that like?
It takes a while. It's meticulous. I actually liked watching it. Made me feel a bit more comfortable about the whole situation. I didn't want to show up and just watch them press one button on the computer and they get a brand new number. They went through box by box, and they did it a couple times and make sure they got it right. It took a while. It was very nerve-wracking, but as a citizen who votes, it made me feel better about, where everything stands. Because you hear all these disaster scenarios with the voters, and we do absolutely have some issues, but watching that made me feel
so how does that work in Georgia where we don't have paper ballots? How does that work? What does a recount look like in Georgia?
I can't tell you the exact thing that happened. There was this great little bar that I was not allowed to go across. But they have all of the machines that were at any of the polling places that were relevant to our race. They have the data from those machines, and they run them again, and they check them for abnormalities. If one machine got 600% more votes than the one next to it, they check for things like that. And then they hand scan every mail-in, absentee, early vote application, everything like that. That's what takes the longest. The computer results rarely ever change a vote, and there are several reasons why paper backups are a great idea. But for this election, they rarely ever change a vote. The mail-ins are where things can kind of change, and then provisionals ballots on whether or not those are actually counted, which again is another thing that we could improve on.
Sure.
But,
Well, we'll talk about that. So you guys won. And we did an article here at App and Media about just the general trend towards a more blue North Fulton. It might be purple now at this point, though. Angelica Kausch won out in Johns Creek House District. But talk a little bit about that trend. What do you see there? What is the reason for that? And do you think it's going to continue?
Well, first of all, 162 votes is not anything that we're sitting back and going, great. Mary will have to get reelected soon. She knows that. So she's going to start engaging with that community again tomorrow or yesterday.
Are you running her reelection?
That's a long way away. Okay. I'm sure I will get that phone call, and I'd be happy
TBD.
I'd be happy to be involved in some way. But, a lot of these incumbents, especially the one in our district, have not had a serious challenge in a while. I think it's hard to discount the Abrams campaign energizing some members of that community so much so that they thought it was actually realistic. Before you get to a point where you might be able to win, you have to convince enough people in that area that it's possible, or else you're not going to have the energy that you need to build up to election day.
People like winners.
Right. And we had amazing volunteer support, and this amazing support from the North Fulton Democratic Party, a party that is finally seeing the fruits of their labor, with neighborhood captains, precinct captains, city captains. This infrastructure helped us get there, but if you don't believe it's realistic, that infrastructure doesn't exist. So the top of the ticket really helped there. And I think a lot of legislators are starting to realize now that with I sound like an old person now, with the advent of social media, that there really isn't a great excuse for not engaging with your community. It's so easy now. You do not have to go door to door anymore. You can host live conferences online, and you can host things at your local coffee shop that you can promote online. So there are not a lot of excuses anymore. So if the most frustrating thing to a voter is, I've never gotten an opportunity to say my piece about this issue, not even where they stand on the issue, but you won't even listen to me, then it's really easy to win over those kinds of voters by hustling and being at their door and being at their local place and telling them you're available. And even if we don't agree, we're available for you. And I think a lot of candidates in the area really went for that. It was a fun contest of how many doors we could knock on. Mary herself got 4,000 doors, I think. And
That's
as a
crazy.
total campaign, we hit 15,000 doors, which is half of basically our voting population in Roswell. So, and we were not the highest number in the kind of North Fulton, North Atlanta area. So I think once we realized it was possible, that hustle and the volunteers and just the simple idea of we will engage with you and you can hold us accountable by coming and talking to us and we will engage with you, won a lot of people over.
I think that's a lesson also to anyone who's thinking about running. If you're not willing to put the work in, your opponent probably is. 15,000 doors. That's a lot of doors.
Well, and I want to say one of the kind of takeaways I've gotten from this is Mary had a fantastic career in healthcare, but she's retired. She does consulting work for different things around the Southeast, but she had the time to go and do this. A lot of people in this area had great careers and are retired or step back from whatever they're doing. If you can't afford to do that, I don't know how you run this. Because as much work as I can do and our volunteers and everything like that, the candidates got to be on the ground. And, you know, there were a lot of candidates for Congress that were able to step back from what they were doing and run that way. And the system's not really conducive to, you know, maybe a younger candidate or a candidate who can't step back from a full-time job, or maybe a single parent, anything like that. I mean, it seems nearly impossible.
No, I can't imagine. Putting 15,000 doors in perspective is hard to do. That's a lot of doors.
And let's also not forget that the general consensus in the state of Georgia is that if you're trying to win a House race, you need somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000. And a lot of candidates throw some of their own money into that. A lot of candidates are, if they're retired from a great career, have those contacts already that are C-suite executives that can throw money into the ring. But again, for people who are, you know, not that fortunate, it's hard to have a network of people that are willing to drop $1,000. I mean, I know I love my college friends to death, but if I put all of them in a room, we could maybe string $12 together between us, and that's not enough to start a congressional race.
You're also 25 though, so give it time.
Yeah, I hope so. Hey, yeah, I'll call them for money at some point. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you one more question about Mary, and then I want to ask you about maybe a couple statewide topics as well. Talk to me a little bit about your conversations with her now that she is the representative elect. What are some of the things that she's working on, and what are some of the things that she's doing to prepare once she's in the House and here in the state?
Well, a lot of the Democrats in our area ran on Medicaid expansion, and we know that the administration that got put into the top of the ticket is...
Yeah, so what now?
It's not going to be easy to support that, but...
He's been pretty unequivocal.
Yeah, but the minority party believes, and there's a lot of evidence that they're right, that the public supports something like this. And, you know, it's that pitch, it's that elevator pitch to Brian Kemp's voters. I mean, the most powerful thing you can do for the people in office right now is tell them, if you don't do this, you will not have your job in 4 years. And with how divided this just was, Kemp and that administration are going to have to find some way to shore up their own seats starting now.
Sure.
I mean, it does not wait anymore. And you saw it today when Kemp goes and talks to the mayor of Atlanta trying to extend an olive branch to Keisha Bottoms. So, I mean, there are things they're going to have to do to start. So I think that's certainly one of them. Another one where the minority feels like they have a lot of public support is universal background checks on guns. But again, Brian Kemp's campaign was not supportive of that idea. And if anything, it kind of ran away from extending those laws and regulations. So, but these are things that... I think it's
safe to say he's far more conservative than Nathan Deal was.
I think so too. And the relationship between him and the mayor of Atlanta, because that was the subject of the campaign, is going to drastically change. And I think it's something that a lot of people in the state have maybe been taking for granted. The relationship we've had between Reed and Deal, Bottoms and Kemp are not the same.
Want to talk about why that's important?
Well, it's mostly important right now because of the crown jewel that's kind of up in the air right now, which is Hartsfield-Jackson. So where does that go? Who takes control of that? Kemp was pretty clear about what he wanted to see happen, but it's been kind of run by the city of Atlanta and a jewel of city of Atlanta for a really long time. And that was it was kind of a general understanding between the last two chief executives of the governor and the mayor that was going to be the case, but not anymore. And the kind of behind the scenes chess that's going to happen in January, February, and March, where you have the new leader of the state and the new leader of the city, is going to be wild. I mean, the people moving things behind the scenes, it's going to be rough. And we may see a couple kind of pawns fall over while it gets to the big the big queen at the end of the line. And there are a lot of projects that may get thrown up in the air too. I mean, there's projects in Savannah that Reed and Deal cooperated on and things like that. So it could be messy.
And they travel together on, economic development trips and talking with companies about luring them to the state or to the Atlanta area. So it is an important relationship.
Hugely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's one of the most important relationships really in the region, the Southeast region of the United States, because Atlanta is so large and the governor of Georgia is so responsible for creating an environment that, new young companies will want to come into. So it's going to be tough. And some of these things like the religious liberty bills and things like that Deal was kind of, hesitant is even a soft word on that. But those things that he wasn't really receptive to, and maybe Kemp will be more receptive to, we will see some of the...
Didn't he pledge to sign?
He pledged to sign it in the way that... The same way that it was at the federal level back in 1998, I think. Yeah. And I think his claim there is it was signed and put forward by, Democrats, so that should be okay. Mm-hmm. I don't know how much legroom that argument is going to have when he really does try and bring it to the floor. And also, having read a lot of legislation the past 3 months, making sure something is exactly the way as it was now, as it was in 1998, is going to be impossible. So
yeah.
When that bill does hit the floor, when that bill does hit the floor,
which it will,
people's ears will perk up and they'll see, well, this is a little different and this is a little different, and that relationship between him and the city of Atlanta as a whole will get very intense. I mean, they cannot exist without each other. I mean, he does not want the city of Atlanta economy to take even a minor setback, like maybe losing the college football playoff in the future or anything like that.
Film industry.
Right. And we've seen examples in North Carolina where they pass similar legislation and then, the NBA pulls out an event and the dominoes start to fall. And yet you're absolutely right. The film industry would be a big one that we'd start to lose.
And they have given indications that they would pull out if such a measure were passed.
Sure. And there are lots of reasons that the film industry has done so well here. But there's nothing here that they can't find in California and New York. So I think we take that for granted too. Georgia's beautiful and I love it here and I'm not leaving, but they can find this, our landscape and our environment other places if we try and push them far.
Absolutely. So I want to ask you, about a couple of statewide races. Talk to me. So you mentioned, you worked on Kevin Abel's campaign. Talk to me a little bit about the 6th district result. Were you surprised? And what kind of job do you think Lucy McBath is going to do in U.S. Congress?
I was a little surprised. I thought she ran a great race. I just thought it wasn't quite time yet for District 6. I knew that the Roswell area, as well as some of Alpharetta and some of Sandy Springs, were closer to turning than maybe some people thought, but you still have Cobb and you still have Milton, and it is large. I mean, when we were looking at it for some work I was doing, it is so large and there's so many different income levels. There's so many different types of people. I mean, to have a single game plan that wins you the whole thing,
right?
I am not sure where I would even begin. So I'm incredibly impressed. It was very close. I mean, percentage-wise, maybe closer than ours. I can't quite remember, but I think she will do a great job. I know she has made promises similar to what we have to come back and talk to the people she represents and have an open dialogue with those people, which in this environment is not an easy pledge to make, especially at that level when those events are going to be televised and publicized. So I know that she's going to be part of a huge new crop of representatives that are going up there with quite a majority. So we'll see what comes out.
Are you convinced that the secret to winning the 6th district is to run on a gun reform message?
I'm not convinced of that. I think that's certainly part of it.
Sure.
I don't think any one issue candidate can win anything in the 6th district. First of all, we'll throw out there the 6th district is incredibly well educated compared to the rest of the country. I mean, it's a much higher...
I want to say the 6th most educated district in the country.
Right.
Prior to Lucy McBath, number 1 Republican district.
Sure.
As far as education level.
Sure. So you're not going to slip by on a one issue platform. It's not possible. And you saw even, one of her big backers was an organization called Every Town for Gun Safety. They're running ads on healthcare for all. And okay, so even these organizations that are kind of single issue focused understand we have to have a multi-platform now to succeed. So, and Karen Handel did not have a single issue platform. So I think Lucy understood, rightfully so, that you have to meet her on every single one of those points. You can't discount her incredibly compelling story, though. I mean, there's a huge difference between being a gun control advocate and being almost like a gun control victim. I mean, which her family, had a horrible tragedy. So you can't discount that story, bringing her to a national front. But there's no one issue that wins over this district. I mean, we had a wide platform that helped. And there are a lot of things that I think people are starting to be less partisan about, and they're starting to just be like, just do something, anything. And, 85% of people wanting universal background checks, Democrats aren't 85% of the population. So clearly there's some double party support there.
Well, and you mentioned her story. Kevin Abel had a compelling story as well. Do you think that's a part of running for Congress these days?
I'll speak as someone who works in the field. It's part of humanizing you as a candidate. One of the first goals you have when you get into a campaign season that is going to be contested, to say the least, and that there's going to be nasty ads flying back and forth, is you find a way to connect with people to soften you up a little bit. And I don't mean to say this, that any of their stories were tactically said or anything like that, but you want to find a way. The first thing you want to do is find a way to have it be so that when you have an attack ad come at you, somebody says, well, that doesn't seem fair. I know that person from, what they put out, and his kids went through this, or his family went through this. And like to come at it that hard seems unfair. So if a voter can have that kind of reaction, it's always a plus. Now, do you need some sort of, superhero origin story? Absolutely not. But you can find ways to connect with people. And a lot of ways is just, I've lived here my whole life. I mean, that's an easy one right there. Like, I am your neighbor. And that's a popular thing here too. So, and you go through what that experience has been like being your neighbor and watching the city change around you. So everybody's got a way to connect with people and kind of break that, what we talked about earlier, that political shell that makes it seem like everything you're saying is calculated. But everyone in that race had a very compelling story. So it certainly made it easier to connect with people for that first time. And then we get into what I'm going to do for you.
Okay. Governor's race. Take either question. Why do you think Stacey lost, or why do you think Brian won?
Georgia is changing in the direction of a Stacey Abrams, whether anyone likes it or not. It is happening. So her showing up as well as she did is already surprising, but it's kind of like I mentioned earlier. If it's not her, it could be the next one. And if it's not that person, it's probably the next one after that. And then the demographics here are changing such that either the parties change to keep up with them, and the Republican Party finds a way to connect with that, or they're going to be out of office soon, in which case they'll find a way then. But I don't think, So
you think it's inevitable?
I think so.
Okay.
Now, I don't think it's inevitable in 2 years or 4 years, but I mean, looking at even somebody like Doug Jones in Alabama, like, this region as a country is changing. And that Democratic stronghold, Black Belt across the Southeast, is starting to vote at record numbers. And that is not something that has any signs of slowing down. So I do think Stacey's win depended on changing the makeup of our democracy in Georgia. That's a large ask. That is a big time ask. And the bad news is that it wasn't enough for her. But the good news for that party is that the work she did is permanent. Because she wasn't trying to run a moderate campaign where she
ran a very different campaign.
Right.
Than
very
Jason Carter.
Exactly. Very progressive. And because of her work to get that infrastructure, it is inevitable. Because now people see a progressive candidate didn't just come close, but they also built the party a little bit. And like I was saying, that work is permanent. So it's coming. Now, I do think Kemp just connected incredibly well with the rural voters, and there's still just a lot of them. I think people overestimate how much Atlanta really counts for. Now Fulton almost pulled Stacey back into it about 2 weeks after the election was over, but it could spread from the suburban areas. Maybe that's what does it. I mean, Gwinnett and Cab have become strongholds for that party, and when you see presidential candidates coming here, which, by the way, you will get ready for it, they're going to be going to Gwinnett, Johns Creek,
thought 2018
Roswell.
Was bad.
Oh my gosh.
Get ready for 2020.
And with the David Perdue race as well.
Sure.
Things in Georgia are about to get a little more wild than I think everybody here is used to. And I was thinking if the governor's race had gone into a runoff as the biggest race left in 2018, I was just going to leave maybe. I don't know if I could handle it. But yeah, it could get a little wild.
So now that I've asked the question and you've answered the question, I'm going to give you a third option.
Oh boy.
Was she at an unfair disadvantage from the get-go? And what I'm referring to, obviously, are the purging of the voter rolls by, at the time, Secretary Kemp.
Yes. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with that last part there. At the time, Secretary Kemp. I mean, there's not, even talking to Republican voters in our district, there's lots of things they like about Kemp, and they probably voted for him, but nobody could really give you a great reason why he was still Secretary of State. It didn't make a lot of sense. If that's a job you could hold on to after the election was over, maybe I see it then. It's still probably selfish, but maybe I see it then, but not even then. I mean, there was another election for that seat. So I don't think a lot of people had great reasons for why he was still in that spot. We saw a lot of consequences of his office continuing to do work while he was in that spot. It was an interesting race because Abrams herself is an expert on that issue. So they got into it a little bit. Of people being purged from the rolls. And it's not just, I think when people think voter fraud and election fraud, they think of actual ballots being cast. But a lot of the systemic issues that were going against Stacey are things that we could so easily fix so quickly. Like, why are we waiting 3 hours in Cobb County to cast a ballot? Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The polls in Roswell had to stay open until 10:30 or 11 at night, because we got a late start voting in that day. That I did not really see coming. But these are issues that happen almost every time we have a major election.
Sure.
And they're easily fixable. So the kind of systemic issue comes a lot from purging people from the rolls and how hard it is to register and things like that, and early vote and mail-in. But really what it comes from is we're now judging people's votes on how willing they are to cast it. If somebody's got 5 minutes to cast a vote, it should count the same as somebody who's got all day. And our democracy is not supposed to work on somebody's raw energy to want to go cast a ballot. And that also goes back to people being purged for not having voted in past elections. I mean, again, it's not really how it's supposed to work. Effort is not a measure of how much your vote should count versus someone else's. So yeah, she was at a disadvantage. I think she overcame a lot. I'm not saying if those disadvantages hadn't been there, she would have won. But it's something I wish we could really take a look at. But unfortunately, we have a very similar administration, and we have new things to worry about now. So nobody's really going to be paying attention to election rules anymore, because as of yesterday, elections are over. So
yeah, so we're recording this the day after the runoff for Secretary of State. So the prior Secretary of State, Brian Kemp, is now the governor, and there was a Republican elected to fill his position, Brad Raffensperger, as Secretary of State. So you don't see that problem being fixed anytime soon?
I don't. And I would love to
be wrong on that one.
I would love it. Love it. But I don't. And even with my fear was that even if Barrow had managed to get elected, which again, we can talk about systemic disadvantages he had going into a runoff as a Democrat. But even if he were to be elected, there are so many things happening in the country right now where sitting legislatures are stripping powers of incoming politicians. And I don't know if even a lot would have changed under him. I think John Barrow would have been fantastic, but I'm not sure he would have had a lot of power by the time he got in there in January.
Sure.
So I don't think a lot of things will change. But the good news is a lot of decisions about this are made very locally. So the Fulton Election Commission, the DeKalb Elections Board, things like that, you can get involved in and actually make differences there. Not everything is done because of the Secretary of State's office. A lot of these problems, like not enough polling places and things like that, can be fixed very locally. And if one of the problems is, though, they have to be started now. I mean, when we got into our race in Roswell in House District 48, we realized months in advance, but still far too late, that we had no early voting spot in our district. And in a place that we usually had it, it was undergoing very scheduled construction. So, but not a great effort was made to substitute
in a
that
city
spot.
of 90,000 people.
Right. So, and there are places outside of the district you can go. I mean, you could have gone to the East Roswell Library, things like that. But for people in the city of Roswell or near Canton Street, that's a little bit of a hike. Mm-hmm. So having districts without early voting spots, these are things that we could probably fix really easily, and we don't have to go through an incoming Secretary of State to fix those. We can just make sure that those are set and ready to go for 2020.
Sure. Have we seen the last of Stacey Abrams?
No, I don't think so. I have no insider information in this.
No insider information, but if you were a betting man and we go back and listen to this podcast in 4 years, what would be your prediction that'll make you look like a genius in 4 years?
I don't know if it makes me look like a genius, but
Senate?
I think she will take.
Is she the
David
front runner
Perdue's
for
seat.
Georgia's Senate seat for the Democratic nominee?
I would think so
right
now. I would think so now. A lot of candidates that were kind of putting their toes in the water. Sally Yates, John Ossoff, they've kind of backed off, and it's possible they've backed off because they see there is a much bigger fish in this water that's about to take up the whole thing. So,
can you imagine Sally Yates in a political campaign for U.S. Senate?
I am a big fan. I'm a big fan of Sally Yates. So I hope we haven't seen the last of her at some point. But I do think Stacey will take on David Perdue. But Perdue's a really good campaigner, and he's been campaigning for re-election since Trump took office in 2016. He knew this was coming, and he has been putting himself on TV and getting his messages out there. So it is not that I'm not so convinced is like the inevitable race I've been talking about, because he has been preparing for this for a long time.
Sure.
So that's
there are few people in the U.S. Senate who have tied themselves more to President Trump than David Perdue has.
And we saw how well that worked in the governor's primary. I mean, one candidate was very much tied to Trump and one was not, and one candidate blew the other one out of the water. So that's not the worst strategy. And if he wants to try and run more towards the middle nearing election day in 2020, he can do that. And that's a blueprint that just worked out. So
it's a good strategy until it's not.
Right. Yeah.
We'll see. All right. Well, Preston, last question for you. You mentioned TBD on running the re-elect for Mary. But other than that, what's next for you? What are you up to?
Well, I'm going to set her up in the Capitol for a little while. Okay. I want to make sure she's able to actually govern for a little bit. I really enjoy campaigning. I don't know if I'll do it again. It's got to be the right candidate. I don't know how many Marys there are out there. But I want to get her set up and then see how I can actually work on the governing side besides all the campaigning. So I'm excited.
Is there a campaign for yourself in the cards one of these days?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
No way. I like being...
That's what Beto O'Rourke said, too.
Yeah, sure.
Might be changing his tune on 2020.
I like being behind the scenes. I don't know if I could be up front like that. After watching a couple people do that, it's hard.
Sure.
So I like the nitty-gritty.
15,000 doors, $150,000. That's what it takes.
Yeah, I have neither of those. So.
Okay. Appreciate you being on the show and all the insight into Mary's campaign, and hopefully we'll talk to you again here soon.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate it.